Hey guys, back again. This is my second time filming chapter 2. Kaiser the cat turned off the video just a second ago. It's fine. So here we go. We're going to read chapter 10. Let me go back to the beginning of Hatchet. Here we go. He could not leave. Nope. He could not at first leave the fire. It was so precious to him, so close and a sweet thing. The yellow and red flames brightening the dark interior of the shelter, the happy crackle of the dry wood as it burned, that he could not leave it. He went to the trees and brought in as many dead limbs as he could chop off and carry, and when he had a large pile of them, he sat near the fire. Though it was getting into the warm middle part of the day, and he was hot, and it broke them into small pieces and fed the fire. I will not let you go out, he said to himself, to the flames. Not ever. And so he sat through the long part of the day, keeping the flames even and eating from his stock of raspberries, leaving to drink from the lake when he was thirsty. In the afternoon, towards the evening, with his face smoke smeared and his skin red from the heat, he finally began to think ahead of what he needed to do. He would need a large wood pile to get through the night. It would be almost impossible to find wood in the dark, so he had to have it all in and cut and stacked before the sun went down. Brian made certain the fire was banked with new wood and then went out to the shelter and searched for good fuel supply. Up the hill from the campsite, in the same windstorm that had left him a place to land the plane, had that only been 3 or 4 days ago, had dropped 3 large white pines across each other. They were dead now, dry, filled with weathered leaves, weathered, dry, dead limbs, enough for many days. He chopped and broke and carried the wood back to the camp, stacking the pieces under the overhang until he had what he thought to be an enormous pile, as high as his head and 6 feet across at the base. Between trips, he added small pieces to the fire to keep it going, and on one of the trips to get wood, he noticed an added advantage of the fire. When he was in the shade of the trees, breaking limbs, the mosquitoes swarmed on him, as usual. But when he came to the fire just near the shelter where the smoke eddied and swirled, the insects were gone. It was a wonderful discovery. The mosquitoes had nearly driven him mad, and the thought of being rid of them lifted his spirits. On another trip, he looked back and saw the smoke curling up through the trees and realized for the first time that now he had the means to make a signal. He could carry a burning stick and build a signal and perhaps attract attention, which meant more wood. And still more wood. There did not seem to be an end of the wood he would need, and he spent all rest of the afternoon and into the dusk making wood trips. At dark, he settled in again for the night, next to the fire, with the stack of short pieces ready to be put on, and he ate the rest of the raspberries. During all of the work of the day, his leg had loosened a bit, but it was still aching, and he rubbed it and watched the fire and thought, for the first time since the crash, that he might be getting a handle on things. He might be starting to do something other than just sit. He was out of food, but he could go look tomorrow and build a fire signal tomorrow and get more wood tomorrow. He slept hard and wasn't sure what awakened him, but his eyes came open. He stared into the darkness. The fire had burned down. Kaiser, oh my goodness, excuse me. Sorry. The fire had burned down and looked out, but stirred a big piece of wood and found a bed of coals still glowing hot with red. With a small piece of wood and careful blowing, he soon had a blaze going again. That had been close. He had to be sure and try to sleep in short intervals so he could keep the fire going. And he tried to think of a way to regulate his sleep, but it made him sleepy to think about it, and he was just going under again when he heard the sound outside. It was not like the sound of the porcupine, something slithering and being dragged across the sand, but when he looked out the door of the opening, it was too dark to see anything. And whatever it was stopped making that sound. In a few moments, he thought he had heard some sloshing into the water at the shoreline. But he had fire now and plenty of wood, so he wasn't worried as if he had been the night before. He dozed and slept for a time, awakened again at the dawn gray light, and added wood to the still smoking fire before standing outside and stretching. Standing with his arms stretched over his head, a tight knot of hunger in his stomach, he looked towards the lake and saw the tracks. They were strange a main center line from the lake in the sand with claw marks to the side leading to a small pile of sand, then going back down to the water. He walked over and squatted near them and studied them and tried to make sense of them. Whatever had made these tracks had some kind of flat, dragging bottom in the middle and was appropriately pushed along by the legs that stuck out to the side. Up from the water, a small pile of sand, then looked back down at the water. Some animal, some kind of water animal that came to the sand to do what? To do something with the sand, to play and make a pile of sand? He smiled. City boy, he thought. Oh, you city boy with your city ways. He had made a mirror in his mind, a mirror of himself, and saw how he must look. City boy with your city ways, sitting in the sand, trying to read tracks and not knowing, not understanding. Why would you think anything wild would come up from the water to play in the sand? Not that way. Animals weren't that way. They didn't waste time that way. It had come up from the water for a reason, a good reason, and he must try to understand the reason. And he must change fully to understand the reason, or he would not make it. He had to come up from the water for a reason, and he thought squatting the reason had to do with the pile of sand. He brushed the top off gently with his hand, but only found damp sand. Still, there must be a reason, and he carefully kept scraping and digging until about 4 inches down, and he suddenly came into a small chamber of cool, damp sand, and there lay eggs. Many eggs. Almost perfectly round eggs the size of table tennis balls. And he laughed, because then he knew. It had been a turtle. He had seen a show on television about sea turtles that came up onto the beaches, laid their eggs in the sand, and there must be fresh water lakes and turtles that did the same. Maybe snapping turtles. He had heard of snapping turtles. They became fairly large, he thought. It must have been a snapper that came up in the night when he heard the noise that had awakened him. She must have come then and laid the eggs. More than eggs, more than his knowledge, more than anything, this was food. His stomach tightened and roiled and made a noise that looked at the eggs as if his stomach belonged to someone else, or had seen the eggs with his own eyes and was demanding food. The hunger, always there, had been somewhat controlled and dormant when there was nothing to eat. But with the eggs came the scream to eat. His whole body craved food with such an intensity that it quickened his breath. He reached into the nest and pulled the eggs out one at a time. There were 17 of them, each round as a ball and white. They had leathery shells that gave instead of breaking when he squeezed them. And when he heaped them into the sand, into a pyramid, he never felt so rich somehow. He suddenly realized that he did not know how to eat them. He had a fire, but no way to cook them, no container, and he had never thought about eating a raw egg. He had an uncle named Carter, his father's brother, who was always putting an egg in a glass of milk and drank it in the morning. Brian had watched him do it once, just once, and then the runny part of the white. Sorry, it's so gross. Okay, then the runny part of the white left the glass and went into his uncle's. Oh, it's so gross to me. Went into his uncle's mouth and down his throat in a single gulp. And Brian almost lost everything he had ever eaten. Same, Brian, same. Still, he had thought. Still, his stomach moved towards his backbone. He became less and less fussy. Some natives in the world ate grasshoppers and ants if they could do that, then he could get a raw egg down. He picked one up and tried to break the shell and found it surprisingly tough. Finally, he used the hatchet he had sharpened on a stick to poke a hole in the egg. He widened the hole with his finger and looked inside. Just an egg. It had a dark yellow yolk, not much. This is really grossing me out. I'm sorry. Not so much white as he thought there would be. Just an egg. Food. Just an egg he had to eat. Raw. He looked out across the lake and brought the egg to his mouth and closed his eyes and sucked and squeezed the egg at the same time and swallowed as fast as he could. It, it had a greasy, almost oily taste, but it was an egg. His throat tried to throw it back up. His whole body seemed to convulse with it, but his stomach took it and held it and demanded more. The second egg was easier. By the third one, he had no trouble at all. It just slid down. He ate 6 of them. He could have easily eaten all of them and had not been full, but a part of him said to hold back and save the rest. He could not now believe the hunger. The eggs had awakened it fully, roaringly so that it tore at him. After the 6th egg, he ripped the shell and licked the inside clean. He went back and ripped the other 5 open and licked them out as well and wondered if he could eat the shells. But there must be some food value in them. But when he tried, they were too leathery to chew and he could not get them down. He stood away from the eggs for a moment, literally stood and turned so that he could not see them. If he looked at them, he would have eaten more. Whew. He would store them in the shelter and only eat 1 a day. He fought the hunger down again and controlled it. He would take them now and store them and save them, eat 1 a day, and then he realized he had. I'm sorry. And he realized as he thought and he had forgotten that they might come, the searchers. Surely they would have come before he could eat all the eggs at 1 a day. He had forgotten to think about them, and that wasn't good. He had to keep thinking of them because if he forgot them and did not think of them, they might forget him. And he had to keep hoping. He had to keep hoping. That was rough. Chapter 11. Let's keep going. Oh. There were these things to do. He transferred all the eggs from the small beach to the shelter, reburying them near his sleeping area. It took all of his will to keep him from eating another one as he moved them, but he got it done, and when they were out of sight again, it was easier. He added wood to the fire and cleaned up the camp area. A good laugh, that cleaning up the camp. All he did was shake out his windbreaker and hang it in the sun to dry. The berry juice that had soaked in it smoothed the sand where he slept. But it was a mental thing. He had gotten depressed thinking about how they hadn't found him yet. And when he was busy, he had something to do. The depression seemed to leave. So there were things to do. With the camp squared away, he brought in more wood. He decided to always have enough on hand for 3 days. After spending one night with the fire for a friend, he knew what a staggering amount of wood it would take. He worked all through the morning at the wood, breaking down the dead limbs and chopping them into smaller pieces, storing them neatly below the overhang. He stopped once to take a drink at the lake and see his reflection. He saw the swelling in his head had nearly gone. There was no pain. He assumed that had taken care of itself. His leg was also back to normal, although he had small patterned holes, roughly star-shaped, where the quills had nailed him. And while he was standing at the lake shore taking stock, he noticed that his body was changing. He had never been fat, but he had been slightly heavy with extra weight just above his belt at the sides. This was completely gone, and his stomach had caved into the hunger, and the sun had cooked him past burning, so he was tanning. And with the smoke from the fire, his face was starting to look like leather. But perhaps more than his body was the change in his mind, or in the way he was becoming. I'm not sure, he thought. I hear differently. He did not know when the change started, but it was there. And when a sound came to him now, he didn't just hear it, but he would know the sound. He would swing and look at it. A breaking twig, a movement of air, and know the sound as if somehow could move his mind back down the wave to the sound of the source. Excuse me. He could know what the sound was before he quite realized he had heard it. And when he saw something, a bird moving a wing inside a bush or a ripple on the water, he would truly see a thing, not just notice it as he used to notice things in the city. He would see all parts of it. He would see the whole wing, the feathers, see the color of the feathers, see the bush, the size and shape and color of its leaves. He would see the way the light moved with ripples on the water, and see that the wind made ripples, which way that wind had to blow to make the ripples in order to move a certain way. None of that used to be in Brian, and now was a part of him, and changed a part of him, and grown a part of him. And the two things, his mind and his body, had come together as well. They had made a connection with each other that he didn't quite understand. When his ears heard a sound or his eyes saw a sight, his mind took control of his body. Without thinking, he moved his face to the sight or sound, moved to make ready for it, to deal with it. There were these things to do. When the wood was done, he decided to get a signal fire ready. He moved to the top of the rock ridge that comprised of the bluff over his shelter and was pleased to find a flat stone area. More wood, he thought, moaning inwardly. He went back to the fallen trees and found more dead limbs, carrying them up the rock until he had enough for a bonfire. Initially, he thought about making a signal fire every day, but he couldn't. He would never be able to keep the wood supply going. So, while he was working, he decided to have a fire ready if he heard an engine or even thought he heard a plane engine. He would run up with a burning limb and set off the fire signal. Things to do. At the last trip to the top of the stone bluff with the wood, he stopped and sat at the point overlooking the lake and rested. The lake lay before him, 20 or so feet below, and he had not seen it in this way since he had come in with the plane. Remembering the crash, he had a moment of fear, breath tightening, a little rip of terror, but it passed and quickly caught up in the beauty of the scenery. It was so incredibly beautiful that it was almost unreal. From his height, he could see not just the lake, but across part of the forest, a green carpet, and it was full of life. Birds, insects, there were a constant hum and song. At the other end of the bottom of the L, there was another large rock sticking out over the water. On top of the rock, a snaggly pine had somehow found food and grown. Bent and gnarled, sitting on the limb, was a bluebird with a crest and a sharp beak, a fisher king. He thought of a picture he had seen once, which left the branch while he watched and dove into the water. It emerged, a split part of a second later. In its mouth was a small fish, wiggling silver in the sun. It took the fish to a limb, juggled it twice, and swallowed the fish whole. Fish. Of course, he thought. There were fish in the lake, and they were food. And if a bird could do it, he scrambled down the side of the bluff and trotted to the edge of the lake, looking into the water. Somehow it never occurred to him to look inside the water, only at the surface. The sun flashing back up at his eyes, and he moved off to the side and took his shoe off. He waited about 15 feet and then turned and stood still, the sun at his back, and he studied the water again. It was, he saw after a moment, literally packed with life. Small fish swam everywhere, some narrow and long, some round, most of them 3 or 4 inches long, some bigger, some smaller. There were a patch of mud off to the side, leading to deeper water. He could see old clamshells there, so there must be clams. As he watched, a crayfish, looking like a tiny lobster, left one of the empty clamshells and went to another, looking for something to eat, digging in with its claws. While he stood, some of the small round fish came quite close to his legs. He tensed, got ready, and made a wild stab at grabbing one of them. Then they exploded away in 100 flicks of quick light, so fast that he had no hope of catching them that way. But soon they came back, seemed to be curious about him, and as he walked from the water, he tried to think of a way to use that curiosity to catch them. He had no hooks or strings, but if he could somehow lure them into the shallows and make a spear, a small fish spear, he might be able to strike fast enough to get one. He would have to find the right kind of wood, slim and straight. He had seen some willows up along the lake, and that might work. And he could use the hatchet to sharpen it and shape it while he was sitting by the fire tonight. And that brought up the fire, which he had to feed again. He looked at the sun and saw it getting late in the afternoon, and when he thought of how late it was, that he ought to reward all of his hard work with another egg, and that made him think of some kind of dessert would be nice. So he smiled and thought of dessert, so fancy, and wondered if he should move up the lake and see if he could find some raspberries after he banked the fire. And while he was looking for the right wood for a spear wood, he thought, and it all rolled together, just rolled together and rolled over him. There were things to do.